end. But just so you know, we do have an option for questions here during the live webinar. That's really kind of the benefit of registering and attending for those who are attending live. So if you have any questions that you would like me to go over during the webinar, what I would say is just enter those in the chat and I will do my best to answer those for you today. So starting us off, first of all, when we're planning for cottages, cabins, up north properties, I really think of these properties as a little bit more of legacy properties. You know, they're different from what someone might want for their primary residence or for what their family is intending to do with the property. Often it's wanting to continue a legacy property like this into generations and set up not only rules, transfer restrictions, but how is this really going to work for your family to ensure that this property is not only maintained and used for them, but a lot of those decisions to allow management and resolve conflicts are going to be in place. So on some of the materials that we'll be going over, there are some tools that can help families plan for these types of legacy properties. And we do right away just, I want to identify, first of all, there are deeds that relate to the ownership interest of a property. There can be deeds that help to pass assets outside of probate. But when we're talking about this concept of legacy properties, it's also important not just to handle the ownership, but to set up your rules, restrictions, and kind of your rule book, so to speak, of going forward, that ongoing management. And oftentimes, deeds aren't necessarily something that is going to help you manage those items. So setting kind of that non-probate transfer aside for a minute, there are some other tools that can be used in coordination with an estate plan. So for example, in coordinations with a trust that help to very clearly lay out rule books for these particular properties and items. So there are partnerships that people can enter into. They're really written agreements kind of between two partners or multiple partners. And that helps to kind of manage co-ownership. But oftentimes in conjunction with a trust-based plan or kind of setting this up, it's important to think about an LLC or a limited liability company. And what that really is in Wisconsin, it helps not only to manage the liability of an asset, like with a cabin, but you can set up rules related to the ownership, management, and future restrictions on properties like this. So it's important that you have a written agreement. So again, more than just kind of that verbal between families as to how you want things to really be managed. And what's super important and very nice about LLC is the idea of being able to also help limit or protect from potential liabilities that often go kind of part and parcel with properties that you may not be at all the time, or as in control of who is on those properties, or could have, larger incidents there. So when it comes to LLCs, it's important to help manage the liability. And what that really does is it helps to limit the liability of an asset to the assets within the LLC only. So there's kind of the concept of them being able to potentially go after what's in the LLC, but not some of the other items that you would have or other things that your kids or family would have based on maybe what was happening with that property. So it's important to know, though, I think there's this little bit of a misconception or myth out there, if you will, that putting a property into an LLC means that property is also protected from things like your long-term care costs. And that's just not true with LLCs on their own. Really, the biggest thing with LLCs is trying to limit the liability, but you'd still have an ownership interest or potentially an available asset for Medicaid or estate recovery purposes. So when someone is concerned about preserving an asset to be able to pass on to the next generation if you have long-term care concerns, it's also important to know that it's an LLC in conjunction with other things potentially is what's going to be helpful, not only to you, but to your family when you're looking at how to best preserve that item. And there has been a new change under basically the new LLC laws that I just like to make clients aware of, which really relates to single member LLCs. And there's just a little bit of a decrease in creditor protection as well when it comes to single member LLCs, which is a little bit of a change. So it's something to be aware of. in terms of, how creditor issues could be handled with single member LLCs going forward. But when we're trying to potentially protect a legacy property like a cottage, cabin, or up north property, part and parcel is related to long-term care, not only for liability, but your own personal liability and needs for those things. So often we're talking about trust-based planning, and I should probably explain that there are also hundreds of different types of trust. This is not, one fit all, but when you're getting into very specifics on planning around Medicaid and things like that, often you're looking more at what's called an irrevocable trust. And there are some protections and things in there, but what's important is that not only is it a non-probate transfer, that you can outline the rule book for your beneficiaries, which is kind of the best of the trust-based planning with the LLC planning. But in this case, you actually could help protect the property from potential creditors, predators and other long-term care needs. And that would be related to your long-term care as well as potentially protection you can set up for future generations, keeping in mind the rule book and parameters that you have. So the concept of ownership is very important when it comes to these properties. Who owns it right now? And also, who are you planning to have own it in the future? And I see a couple of things related to this for families, either mom and dad owning the property now and thinking about how is it going to transition down to kids. I also see families that co-own together right now with their siblings or other people that they are close to. Especially in situations where you have a current co-ownership, it's very, very important that you and those other people that you own it with have an understanding of what is going to happen to this property when those original kind of first generation of owners pass. Because if you're three people, three groups of people, and you're planning on having it go down to those kids, and that's 3 or 4 kids a person, that's suddenly many, many people to get on the same page about a property, when they can go up and use the property, how taxes are going to be handled, how maintenance is going to go. All of those things are very important for owners to figure out and work together. And it's the kind of example of a cabin with 100 owners that, unfortunately you see, which is where if those individuals can't decide on those very important issues, then that's when a property goes unused and is not maintained. And if your goal is not only to help preserve the property, but preserve kind of the family connection that creates, this is why these rules can be so important, because otherwise people, you might really know your siblings and get along well with your siblings, but are people going to know their cousins or their second cousins or whatever it turns out to be? And how many hands do you really want, making ownership or management decisions? There's also really cool ways and related to your trust, actually funding some of the LLC to help it continue on for years to come. I see this especially with clients when there might be a little bit more of a financial difference between their children. Like one child might not have any problem contributing money to cover taxes and maintenance and a boat or whatever it would be. And for another child, that might be really difficult, but that doesn't mean that they might not want to use the property or that you wouldn't want them to have full use of the property. So there's different structures in terms of funding for an LLC that can be possible to help sustain it across generations. But you also want to be clear on who the owners are, who's, voting, controlling, how are expenses paid. And you really can do that with an LLC plus, the liability protection that can potentially, help insulate for your family. The only other part I'd make on that, when parents are looking to transition on to the next generation, is who really is interested. Because this is excellent planning when you have a group of people that is going to want to sort through and manage and care for this property. But if all of your kids don't really actually want to own it or go up to it or take care of it, then sometimes it's not something that is more worth setting up in that way. Different from preserving the value of it. If your intent not only is that, but to continue it on, that's why the LLC is so important, but you need to have the conversation with those people and ask them, what their expectations are for the property, what they're hoping to do with it, and how you can best kind of formulate a plan as a family to make sure that your intent is carried through. So I don't think I've seen any questions come in, but I did just want to take a brief break and see if anyone has anything that they'd like to ask from kind of what we've talked about. Okay, well, not waiting too long, but again, you can ask questions either here, or you can email learn more at hooperlawoffice.com if you have any questions you like to ask outside of that. Otherwise, next week we won't really be having a webinar because we are going to be having our Wills versus Trust seminar here in Appleton next week at the Bordini Center. It's right across from Fox Valley Tech. But then after our seminar next week, we will kind of be back to our regular webinars. And that topic will be, do my children inherit my debt when I die, which is going to be talking a little bit more in depth on some of those issues of insolvent estates or things like that. So again, after the session, you're going to be emailed a brief survey. I'll take your feedback, constructive or otherwise, always. And then just so you know, Hooper Law Office, we focus primarily on estate planning and elder law, but within those areas, there's lots of topics that we're able to assist with. Planning for LLCs, family properties, family farms are definitely part of that. So if you would like to meet with an attorney to be able to discuss your estate plan in specific, we do offer 2-hour complimentary initial consults. What we do is we'd send you some information to fill it out as best you can. And then what we say is by the end of really that 2 hours, the attorney that you work with should have a pretty good sense of what they might recommend to you. And then we'll kind of be able to move from there. So thank you all so much for your time. And again, if you have any questions, you can shoot us an email, give us a call, and that survey will have the materials from what we discussed.